If anyone wants to join the coven, let me know. And I said, I'm sold. In other words, I'm a fraud. It's time for my September reading wrap up. For this month, I read 5 physical books, 2 audiobooks, and I would say that there's a pretty good range. I have some gothic literature, a retelling, 2 vampire books, a short story collection, a memoir, and a book that I think is a perfect transition from summer over to fall. Let's get into it. Before we get into the books, I wanted to share my statistics. I know some people like it. I personally love my stats. According to my Fable, my reader summary says, Gothic feminist. You haunt the shelves for stories blending female strength, shadows deep enough to hide secrets. Are you sure you're not starting your own coven with your reading list? If anyone wants to join the coven, let me know. I'm gonna start with, I don't know if I should rank them from my most favorite to my least favorite or go in chronological order. I'm just gonna randomly get started. The first book is a memoir and it is called Sociopath. I listened to this as an audiobook over on the app called Everand. I do have a subscription. I really feel like it's worth paying the money. There's so many options and that's how I found this audiobook. Trix's memoir is all about her struggle with getting this diagnosis and how when she was growing up, she recounts a lot of these experiences that now she's able to dissect and understand, but at the time it was a lot of the adults around her reprimanding her, not understanding her, and her not understanding where the disconnection is because she naturally just didn't feel those types of emotions. She didn't have the empathy, the emotional understanding for certain situations that she was in, how she blindly had to maneuver and understand the world in a way that no one else did, or she felt that way. It was really interesting comparing the things that she would do when she was much younger and how they continued to increase in intensity as she became older, and the things that she would do to maneuver herself around this world that she didn't fully understand. And there always felt like there was this big disconnect. But that disconnect is what pushed her forward, trying to find an answer, trying to figure out what the diagnosis meant, not only for her, but for others. I don't rate memoirs, so I'm not gonna give it a star rating. I find rating a memoir a bit icky. Like, I guess you could just focus on the framework or the structure, the writing, but I just prefer not to rate them. I did really enjoy it. I would recommend it for you as well, and I really liked the audiobook. The next 2, I don't really know how to feel about, because we have a short story collection. This is called Wild Failure. This was sent by the publisher, and I just want to read the back because sometimes I find that explaining a short story collection is a bit tricky. But this focuses around characters that encounter feelings of shame, desire, attachment, and disconnection as they navigate through bad decisions, unusual situations, and fraught relationships. It's also a dynamic and vibrant collection of poetic fiction that contends with the meaning of desire in a world that devalues femininity and queerness. A lot of these stories personally just didn't work for me. I didn't find quite memorable. There was just something about it that I didn't like. The only 2 that stuck out to me that I personally enjoyed was Wild Failure and A Patch of Bright Flowers. My goal every month is to read a short story collection. In my mind, I feel like I can start the month maybe 1 story a day, 2 stories a week, depending on how many short stories are in the collection, and then be able to get through it. However, that is never the case, and the majority of the time I never finish short story collections. I read a couple, I'm halfway, I'm 75%. For whatever reason, I just don't pick it back up. I was able to finish this, so I feel like that has to show for something. But also I was reading this during my 24-hour reading challenge. Would I have finished it if I wasn't? I don't know. But short story collections are really hit or miss, and that ultimately I would still read from the author again. Moving on to the other book that I don't have a physical copy of, it is Diavola. I thought it was pronounced Diavola, but the author says Diavola. And this is a book that I think would be a really good transition from summer into fall. In this book, we follow a character named Anna. Anna's getting ready to go on a family trip to southern Italy, which sounds great, but Anna is more of the black sheep in the family, meaning that whenever something goes wrong, all fingers point to Anna. Anytime she talks about a family trip in the past, something comes up, Anna's fault, no questions asked. So Anna's expectations for this trip are quite low. Dynamic within the family is quite tense as well. Both of her siblings are bringing their partners, and then her sister's also bringing her kids, and then her parents. Lucky for Anna, they're staying in this really big house. It's beautiful. All the tourists want to book it, but the residents in the area always recommend don't stay there. And the story goes from there. The cover did remind me for whatever reason of The Haunting of Hill House. So it does kind of have that similarity with House almost feeling like a character within the book, which is something that I love. Unfortunately, this did not work for me. I actually started reading this book a few months ago. I started listening to the audiobook. Initially, I really liked it when we were getting introduced to the family members and the setting. We started to list off some things that were going on in the home. I was really, really engaged with it. And then things started to feel like they were kind of falling flat. The dynamic within the family, the events that were taking place, so I decided to put the audiobook down. And then this month I decided, you know what, I was already halfway, I should just finish it, maybe it gets better. I think if I was not listening to the audiobook and I was reading a physical copy, I would not have finished this book. There was just something that didn't work for me. I think what it was is that it started to feel like a Riley Sager book. Like, that author, you are going to like this book. His books have never worked for me. I don't like how he does his endings, and this book felt like it was falling under similar lines. I still think it's a great transitional read. If it sounds like something you might be interested in, by all means. We can move on to the vampire books, and they both ended up being for book clubs. The first one is Interview with the Vampire. This is for a sibling book club that I have. We started it once we all started to move and be on opposite coasts, and this is a way for us once a week to get together, talk about a book, break it apart. And so this is a book that we ended up picking. I brought this up as an option because I remember, I think it was 2 years ago, watching the show Interview with the Vampire. And at the time, I didn't know it was based off of this book. So when I found that out, I thought it would be really interesting to read the book, compare it to the show. I really enjoy comparing media. I just find it really interesting to see like what a show thought, what elements needed to be shown, whereas a book decides to focus on different things, but the overall goal is to get a very similar message across. The discussions we had around it were really interesting because we were able to compare elements from the show that weren't as developed within the book or vice versa. I had no idea that this was a series, so I definitely will be continuing on with the series. This was quite enjoyable. Next vampire book was Thirst. This was for my personal book club over on Fable. I feel a bit torn with this one only because the book is broken up into 2 parts. So the first part, we have an unnamed vampire. She is traveling through Europe, gets turned, and then creator is this awful human being. She has these sisters. Basically, she ends up losing everything and then decides to move from Europe over to Buenos Aires. And the rest of the book, setting-wise, is in Buenos Aires. Second part, we move over to another character named Alma. Alma is processing grief. She is a single mother with a young kiddo. She is losing her mother, dealing with the anticipation of grief, unpacking it when it does come, and trying to figure out how part 1 and part 2 are connected. The only thing that I feel is I went into this book knowing very little, and when it started in part 1, that's what I thought the whole book was going to be like. It's very descriptive. It talks about seeing a random figure at the end of the hall with this beautiful gown, and she's illuminated by the moonlight. All the descriptions within Gothic literature that are just, they're beautiful, they're a staple, I love them. So I really loved part 1. I was super into it. I was highlighting a bunch. Here, there's a line here, it says, I, seated at the piano, composed music like sinister creatures, slithering through the darkness, like ghosts dancing by candlelight, like the dead shedding their souls as if they were dresses fallen out of style. Just so you can get an idea for the writing style. I loved it. I was really engaged with part 1. This unnamed vampire does something within a church that I personally thought was hilarious. It was so out there. I was having a really good time with it. And then we get to part 2, and it is just a complete night and day difference as far as the tone, the characters, and I just was not expecting that hard switch from one to the other. My initial thought was that it felt like 2 completely separate books. I understand the similarities between the 2 and the sense of agency, the loss that both of these characters feel, regardless of the many centuries that have passed between them two. There's still this invisible thread that connects one to the other. I can see that and appreciate that, but I felt like maybe the pacing of part 2 felt a little off because all of a sudden in part 2 we are in contemporary Buenos Aires with a complete different character. Mood is very heavy because she's experiencing this loss of her mother being sick. We focus a lot on that. We get some moments with her son, and then it felt like the ending, trying to connect part 1 and part 2, just felt rushed for me personally. I would have preferred the focus on how part 1 and part 2 are connected and have that feel a bit more developed, because it just felt like we were running out of time. This is what happened. Okay, done, epilogue. I think that's where my disconnect with the book is coming from. Overall, is it beautiful? Yes. Do I love the writing? Yes. I would read from this author again, 1000%. I think I would have enjoyed the book more if I would have had a different mindset going into it. And now we can move on to the final 2 books on this wrap up. The first one is The Garden by Claire Beams. I randomly just picked this book. This book got put on my radar because of the Aardvark Book Club subscription that I have. I thought the cover was beautiful and it talked about being within the realm of Gothic literature literature, and I said, I'm sold. I mentioned this in my Gothic literature book recs. We follow a character named Irene, who up until this point has had 5 miscarriages. Irene and her husband decide to travel to this home that got redone to be a kind of temporary facility for all these women that have had a lot of miscarriages. There are 2 doctors, and they are doing this experimental treatment, and they guarantee you will have a child. So all of these characters are in an extremely vulnerable position. They know what it feels like to have that loss multiple times, and just focusing on the emotional, the physical, the mental strain that can have on a person. And you find these doctors that promise you to have a child that you so desperately want, you're signing up. So that's what Irene does. She signs up. She has minimal contact with her husband because every day the doctors have some assignments for all the women that are there. Is Irene fully buying into it? That's another question. She's very outspoken. She does not care who is around when she does so. One day when she's walking around in this big estate on the outskirts of it, she finds this garden, and then the story goes from there. This is divided into 5 or 6 parts, I believe. I think the commentary on it within our current political climate was really important. I really liked the Gothic twist that it had on it. And this one was a variety of genres. It would be like literary, feminist, Gothic, historical, all wrapped up into one. This one was quite interesting, and I think overall I really enjoyed it and I would recommend. Now for last, we have Lady Macbeth. I think this one was another really tricky one for me because, well, I have to be honest, okay? I picked this book up because I saw it online everywhere. I think the cover is absolutely beautiful. This image reminds me of Anya Taylor-Joy, and I love the veil. I just thought it was perfect, and I said, you know what? I want it. I picked it up, but I must admit, I know nothing about Macbeth. I knew nothing about Lady Macbeth. I cannot give you any type of comparison or feedback into that. I'm simply a reader who picked the book up because of the cover. That is what I am basing this off. In other words, I'm a fraud. I did a tandem read of this, so I would read the physical book and then listen to the audiobook and kind of switch off that way. I feel very similarly to the other books that I read in that in the beginning, I was really into it. I was engaged, thought that it was so fascinating. I believe I only had 25% left, and that's when I started to lose interest. I didn't want to keep picking the physical book back up. I'd have to swap over and just finish the book on audio. I kept hoping that the ending would be better, and I didn't really like it. I can see what the author was trying to do, and I do see it in some moments of Lady Macbeth taking her agency back and making these decisions for herself and not for others. There were certain points in it that felt a little blurred. I would definitely check content warnings for this, and maybe those moments that I feel like it was blurred, maybe I just lack the backstory of Lady Macbeth to understand it fully. I don't know. That's why I take what I say right now with a grain of salt as someone who doesn't have the context. Ava Reid is an author that I have read in the past with Juniper and Thorn. I'm not a big fantasy reader, but I am an Ava Reid fan. So will I read any book that Anna Reid publishes? Yes. Will I technically enjoy it all the time? Sometimes, but I'll still read an Ava Reid book. So I don't know. I know since its publication, this book has been quite polarizing within the book community. So if you've read this, I'm really interested to see your thoughts on it and what you ended up reading it. Before I started filming this, I thought that I had such a good reading month. And as I was talking about the books more in detail, I started to think, you know what? It wasn't actually all that good. It was kind of like somewhat in the middle with some good books as outliers. Like I think the only 2 that I really loved was The Garden, Interview with a Vampire, and then the memoir Sociopath. I would say that was my top 3 of the month. The other 4 just felt somewhere in the middle, missing a little here, missing a little there. Definitely not the worst reading month I've had. I loved the mood I was in. I definitely feel like I just immediately jumped into the darker themed books. I immediately started with the vampires, didn't even want to wait until October. But now I can go ahead and start with my October reads, and I'm really excited. Just wanted to give you some thoughts on my September reading. Let me know how your reading month went, if you had any favorites, and thanks for watching.